I couldn't think of a better person to give us a little perspective on things today than our next guest. He grew up in South Georgia or Southeast Georgia. He's lived here in Salt Lake City now for the better part of, almost 50 years. He's one of the most respected men in our community, and he's also somebody that was part of probably the last real big movement for social justice and civil rights in our country back in the 60s and in early 70s. Of course, I'm talking about Reverend France Davis, who is formerly now of the Calvary Baptist Church, retired of sorts, but I don't think when you're in his position you ever really retire. Reverend Davis, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Am I accurate in that statement? In your position, retirement is a word, but it may not necessarily be what you do, right?
Absolutely. I certainly haven't gotten there yet anyway.
So I would be curious to ask you and just start where we're at right now as somebody that grew up and participated in the civil rights movement and were very active in it in the 60s. As you look at the climate and where we are today, what do you make of our country and where we're at?
Well, in many ways, we're the same, and in other ways, it's different. It's the same in that many of us thought that we had reached the goal of equality and fairness and justice and all of those sorts of things, good treatment by the authorities. But it's different in that now it's not just people of African American descent that are concerned about those issues, but it's many people of different types and kinds that are out there. If you look at the marchers, the protesters, they come largely from many different communities.
I'd be curious, you say there are similarities, and you highlighted some of those. Is it better today or worse today? It's hard for people of a certain age to have the perspective you have. I always joke about getting older, Reverend Davis. There's not many advantages to getting older, but getting older does give you perspective, and you have seen a lot of things the older you get. I'm 50, so I have pretty good perspective. You're a little bit older than me, so you've got even better perspective. Are things overall better than they were years ago? Because some people would like you to believe they haven't changed enough.
Well, I think they're better in many ways, but I agree with those who say that they have not changed enough. I mean, there's no reason why Mr. George Floyd or anybody else has to die the way he did at the hands of authorities. And there's no justification, no way to justify that in my view. So I think in many ways we have not come far enough. We've come a long ways. We've got the laws in many cases on the books. The policies need to be massaged, and the practices is where we really need to be working hard.
Reverend Davis with us here, retired from Calvary Baptist, but not retired from activism, that's for sure. You know, today we have camera phones, and we have social media, and we have the internet. Messages and pictures can travel much quicker. Back in your day in the 60s, you might get some film or some news coverage that might come here and there, but I guess in many ways we always hear the term that a picture could tell 1,000 words, and we had a picture of what happened to George Floyd on the streets in Minneapolis, and we've had pictures of other incidents. Do you think that that's raised awareness or maybe really pushed this effort a little bit more because we're actually seeing it, not just hearing about it?
I think it's raised the issue, first of all, more and pushed it more. For people like myself, we've lived with the kind of things that happened to Mr. Floyd for years. And it's been going on since back in the 1800s that people have died tragically, and we've dismissed that, or we didn't even know about it. Now, with camera phones and the computers, word travels fast and travels everywhere. So it's the whole world that is gotten the word in this case, when before it was a narrow part.
It's hard to do, and I'm sure you've been asked this question thousands of times in your life, but you were part of a very unique movement in the 1960s, and you were part of a march that is now very famous, the Selma to Montgomery March. Give our listeners in 2020, Reverend Davis, an idea of what that march was like. What was the atmosphere around it for those that participated in it, and then those that were surrounding it and watching it? Take us back to Alabama then.
In Alabama during the 1960s, voting rights was the problem. And it's still the problem in many places that we are talking about how do we ensure that everybody has a fair opportunity to participate fully in the electoral government that we have. So back in the 60s, though, there were poll taxes, there was property ownership, there was literacy tests. There were all sorts of restrictive ways to keep people of color, African Americans in particular, from participating in the process. And our goal was to say to those people who had a place to stay and a job that they would likely lose if they were out front, that we as students don't have any vested interest here, so we'll help you. And we set out and helped by marching and doing a lot of things to help the citizens that was there. The South was in those days very segregated still and separated, and people were treated differently in so many ways, not only on the buses and the trains and the theaters and the boats, but also in terms of public facilities.
Did you fear for your life, or what was your mindset when you're participating in those marches, Reverend Davis?
I feared for my life, but I also was sort of calloused to the harm that would come my way. I knew that the Klan was there. I knew that the Confederate flagged National Guard was there, and I worried a bit about that. But at the same time, was willing to take the risk and to help. And I think that's where all of us as a society in 2020 have to get. And that is to a place that we are ready to take the risk, and no matter what the price is. Dr. King said, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land.
You met and had interactions with Dr. King. What was that like as a young man?
Dr. King was a very personable, highly trained and educated, but caring person. He was the kind of person who, if you went on looks alone, you wouldn't have thought he was that much, but when he opened his mouth, you knew you were in the presence of greatness.
A great man, France Davis, Reverend France Davis, with us here on the Bill Riley Show today as we're talking a little bit about the climate of the country right now. So I moved to Salt Lake City in 2001, and I had a lot of people tell me it had changed, and I've been here 19 years now, Reverend Davis, and I've seen it change. You came here in 1972. I have no idea what it must have been like for you then, especially as someone that grew up primarily and lived primarily in the South. How have you seen this community, this state, change over the years from 72 until now?
Well, I've watched, first of all, the educational system make major changes in that it is now almost commonplace that people of color would be invited to participate in all of the schools, public and private, beyond high school here in the state of Utah. I've also watched the legislature become more, back in the 70s, more interested in fair housing and issues that affected all of the people. So I've watched the acceptance, I've watched the religious groups make their change and ask for forgiveness for their mistreatment of people of color, people who were African descent. And so I've watched all of those kind of changes. We still have to do something, though, about the political system. We are one one-party state for the most part. And as long as that exists, and there are many who will not have a voice.
Again, change very rarely happens quickly, as you know very much, in these topics that we're talking about now. Do you think it just will take time and getting a more diverse population and people from the outside moving in? How does that political change come in your mind in this state?
Well, I think the political change comes with the change of attitudes, and that's what takes such a long time. In the Bible, it took 40 years to change the attitude of the children of Israel, and a whole generation had to die before they actually changed. So I think part of what we are up against is we don't like to see a whole lot of people die, but that may be part of the cost of bringing about positive change that will be for the good of all.
Reverend France Davis, formerly of the Calvary Baptist Church, talking with us here on the Bill Riley Show today. Now, I consider myself a pretty good historian. I was a history minor in college. You were somebody that fought very, very hard, in this state especially, to make Martin Luther King Jr. Day a state holiday. Educate our listeners a little bit as to what tomorrow means to the Black and African community in this country. Juneteenth is what they call it. I considered myself a pretty up-to-date historian, but I wasn't very familiar with the history of June 19th, Juneteenth. Why is it so important to the Black community and Black culture in our country?
Back in the 1860s, the President of the United States issued an Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves. Unfortunately, in some places like Galveston, Texas, those slaves, that Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January, but those slaves didn't find out that they were free because their labor was also free to their owners until June 19th. And June 19th is the day that represents freedom for people of African American descent, and it's almost like a holy day for us.
Should it be a national holiday?
I think it should be a national holiday, much like any of the other major holidays. Of course, we are afraid to keep offering holidays because it costs us to pay people to take a day off. But it could be a national holiday where people would get busy, learning more, historically becoming more grounded and more familiar.
For those that don't know, Reverend Davis also plays a role in sports in this community, and as long as I've been around, you've been around Utah football, and you're the chaplain and advisor in many ways with Utah football. Now, how did that come about? Just walk me through that, because I know that's something that's pretty important to you, being able to be around those young men.
When Coach Urban Myers came to town, one of his planks in his plan was to have well-rounded young men who not only were good sports people, good academic, and so forth and so on, but also he wanted them to have a spiritual component that went along with that. And so he invited me to work with him and the football team. After he left, and I didn't go with him, Coach Whittingham continued the process, seeing the value in having all four of the tires of an automobile inflated so that the car would run evenly. So that's what it means to the football team to have a chaplain that can help them to have lessons about how to live every day, not just on the court, on the field.
You enjoy it too, don't you? I mean, you've done it.
I enjoy it very much, and it keeps me in touch with the younger people. And in fact, I sometimes think I'm young myself because I'm so in touch with what's happening with the young people through the football team.
Well, that's good.
I'm now working with the whole sports program. So I'm working with the basketball coaches and teams as well. So I'm trying to help them all to understand that we need well-rounded, that's maybe the answer to our bigger problem of race in the community, is to have people be respected, not just when they are in their sport, but also when they live their everyday life.
Before I let you go, I'd just like to kind of come back around again to this as somebody that has lived and seen it and seen some good movement, but also seen maybe not enough in some areas too. What do you hope, Reverend Davis, comes out of this movement that's both local, national, and it's become international as well, on social justice and maybe police reform as well? What would you like to see in the short term, but maybe more important, what would you like to see come out of this long term?
Well, what I'd like to see happen is that we do not drop the ball simply because it cools off. We are a crisis-oriented society, and we respond to issues in the midst of those crises. And when the crisis is over, we oftentimes forget them, and we no longer do much about them. So I'm hoping that this one will be of such a familiarity and such a great demand on all people's parts that it will continue for many years to come.
Well,
now, what would that look like? That'll look like people getting registered to vote, going to the polls and voting for the representatives, government. It will also mean that the laws, the policies, and the practices of our authorities will be reviewed and will always be humanly oriented.
Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful because people like the current chief of police in the Salt Lake, the mayor of Salt Lake City, they are willing to work. The legislators are considering what they can do. And so, yes, I'm hopeful that things will happen. I don't think it'll all happen, though, within my lifetime. Hopefully, though, within my son, my grandson, my great-grandson's lifetime, they'll be able to see it all happen.
Well, I hope it happens, a lot of it, within all of our lifetimes, especially yours, because we need you around this community and we need you around Utah football and Utah athletics, continuing to be a great mentor. Hey, I really appreciate you coming on, Reverend Davis, with me today. I've, as I said before, we've been on so many airplane flights together and stood in so many security lines and hangars and things together. I'm glad we could get together on the radio and chat a little bit. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure, and we'll talk to you another time.